Good evening, I'm Alma Angeles, and you're watching Eagle News International on tonight's headlines. Several explosions rocked Kiev early Wednesday, with emergency services saying 2 residential buildings were damaged. 2 people were wounded. The United States will unveil a new round of security assistance to Ukraine as Western leaders faced mounting pressure to stop Russia's bombardment of civilians, and peace talks made halting progress. And North Korea fires a suspected ballistic missile that explodes mid-air shortly after launch, according to Seoul, with analysts warning it is likely a failed test of Pyongyang's so-called monster missile. First in our news, several explosions rocked Kiev early today, according to AFP journalists in the city, with emergency services saying 2 residential buildings were damaged. 2 people were also wounded. Now, the blast came as Russia intensifies attacks on the Ukrainian capital, which was placed under curfew late Tuesday due to what its mayor called a difficult and dangerous moment. At least 3 loud explosions were heard just after dawn in the western part of the city, and thick clouds of smoke billowed into the sky. Nearly 3 weeks after the invasion of Ukraine, Russian forces hemming in Kiev on 2 sides have stepped up their attacks, with many in the capital fearing a full-on assault could come soon. Battles continue to rage in cities like Mariupol, Kharkiv, and Mykolaiv, as well as in suburban towns just outside Kiev. And residents are overcome with emotion as they survey the damage inside their flats after a missile landed near their 10-story residential building in Kiev, injuring several people. Take a look.
Тут мы спали, спасибо. Если бы вы тут спали, мы бы не остались. Нам повезло, что мы в стороне было. Удар был вот сюда. Посмотрите. Вот. Просто на уничтожение украинского.
Да. 5:40.
Вы свет тут включили? Да?
Да, все. Где-то без 10:05 я лежал, еще проснулся, думаю, что-то чуйка плохая. Да. Только поднимаюсь, такой резкий хлопок, меня скинуло с кровати. Я упал, ноги порезал. Да. А потом после этого, так, как начали убирать, возник пожар. Снизу, с 4-го этажа, пошел пожар. И оно загорелось все.
Сами понимаете, Рагулина.
Мы пенсионеры.
Или что, но взрыв очень большой. Просто оно все вот так, во сне спали же люди, оно все вот летело. Я просто поражаюсь, как не попала ни у кого. Вы понимаете, меня еще мама, инвалид незрячая, не ходячая, забрали в больницу. Ну, вот сами понимаете. Просто я держалась, а это просто, не знаю, начала просто такая реакция, потому что страшно.
Meanwhile, the United States will unveil a new round of security assistance to Ukraine today as Western leaders face mounting pressure to stop Russia's bombardment of civilians, and peace talks made halting progress. A White House official said President Joe Biden will also unveil another $800 million worth of military aid, expected to include more of the anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles that have helped slow Russia's 3-week-old invasion to a crawl. Here's President Biden.
We've already committed more than $1.2 billion in security assistance to the people of Ukraine just over the past year. And I know all of you know that. It's been providing anti-armor, taking out tanks, anti-air capabilities directly to the Ukrainian forces. And we're also facilitating significant shipments of security assistance from our allied partners to Ukraine. And I'll have much more to say about this tomorrow, about exactly what we're doing in Ukraine. We're also going to be better positioned to provide for the rapidly growing humanitarian needs of the Ukrainian people. This war has turned nearly 3 million Ukrainians into refugees, with numbers growing every single day.
Ukraine State Emergency Service said a 12-story residential building was among the targets hit, with at least 2 people injured, 37 evacuated. A nearby building damaged. Kiev was subjected to a fresh round of bombardment overnight, with columns of smoke rising high into the morning sky. Ukraine State Emergency Services said this is the 12-story residential building that was among the targets that was hit. Now, Western military experts believe Russia is increasingly turning to air bombardments after an initial ground invasion stalled and as possible leverage in negotiations. Meanwhile, this latest series of attacks coincided with a visit to Kiev of a trio of Polish, Czech, and Slovenian leaders and the introduction of a 35-hour curfew. The 3 countries have been among the most forthright in calling for a tougher Western approach to Moscow.
The European Union has to give very quickly a candidate status, and more than this, has to invite Ukraine to the European Union and all the defensive weapons to defend your homes. We will try to orchestrate all over the world.
We are doing everything in our capacity to help you, to help the refugees coming from Ukraine. And we are totally aware that the most important thing is to help Ukraine with weapons, defensive and offensive, for Ukraine to be able to defend the land, the sea and the sky.
You are fighting for your lives, for your families, for your country, for freedom. But we know you are fighting also for our lives and for our freedom.
Now, during the visit, Poland's Vice Premier Jarosław Kaczynski called for the deployment of a NATO or other international peacekeeping mission that will be able to defend itself and that will operate on Ukrainian territory. Such appeals have so far received little support in the West, where there's fear such moves could trigger a catastrophic war with nuclear-armed Russia. Instead, Western nations have opted to isolate Russia diplomatically and economically. They have introduced crippling sanctions that have pushed Russia towards a possible default on its debt and forced Moscow out of many international political and sporting forums. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said meetings will still continue on talks aimed at ending Russia's military attack against. Again, let's listen in.
Це важливо. Складно, але важливо, тому що будь-яка війна завершується угодою. Зустрічі тривають. Як мені доповідають, позиції на переговорах звучать вже реалістичніше. Проте ще необхідний час, щоб рішення були в інтересах саме України.
President Putin, meanwhile, accused Kiev of not showing a serious commitment to finding mutually acceptable solutions, according to the Kremlin's account of a call with EU Council leader Charles Michel. Now, President Zelensky also earlier told Ukrainians that they may need to put aside thoughts of joining NATO. That was always a faint prospect, but one which Russia has repeatedly cited as a justification for its own invasion. Take a look.
Зрозуміло, що Україна не є членом НАТО, ми це розуміємо, ми адекватні люди. Роками ми чули про нібито відкриті двері, але вже почули також, що нам туди не увійти, і це правда, і треба це визнавати. Я радий, що наш народ починає це розуміти і розраховувати на себе і на наших партнерів, які нам допомагають.
Meanwhile, Russia's foreign ministry announced sanctions on U.S. President Joe Biden and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, alongside several officials in a reciprocal response to Western measures. The measures also applied to U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and is the consequence of the extremely Russophobic policy pursued by Washington, according to Moscow in a statement. In a separate statement, Russia's foreign ministry also announced punitive measures against 313 Canadians, including Prime Minister Trudeau and several of his ministers. In response to Russia's military intervention in Ukraine, the U.S. banned Russian President Vladimir Putin and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, while adopting sanctions largely cutting Russia off from the rest of the world financially. And we'll be back with more news right after this break. Stay tuned.
Mr. Bawal, may ibis ka, oh. Asan? It's a prank! Okay lang manakot. Pero kung mananakot ka para sa boto, bawal yan!
Ayon sa Omnibus Election Code, threats, intimidation, terrorism, use of fraudulent device or other forms of coercion is an election offense.
Sino kausap mo? Makaalis na nga, sa iba na lang ako mananakot. Mr. Pwede! Mr. Pwede! May malaking ibis sa likod mo! Nox! Mabawi ka pa, ha? Di mo ako maiisahan! Ako si Mr. Bawal na nagpapaalala sa inyo na ang pananakot para sa boto. Ibis! Hoy! Bawal yan!
A public service message of Net25 for Mata ng Halalan 2022. Matatag, matapang, matapat.
Alam namin ang iyong pagsisikap. Dama namin ang iyong mga sakripisyo. Kita namin ang pagharap mo sa bawat pagsubok. Kaya sa kabila ng mga hamon ng buhay, nandito kami para umalalay. Kasi katulad mo, gusto rin namin ang magandang bukas para sa kanya. Hatid namin ang dekalidad na edukasyon at makabagong pasilidad sa abot kayang halaga. Kaya huwag ka na mangamba. Sasamahan ka namin tuparin ang mga pangarap niya. Maaasahan mong sulit dito ang mga pinagsikapan mo. Sa aming mga makabagong pasilidad at sistema ng edukasyon. Mailalabas natin ang aking talino at mga kakayahan niya. Kahit sa munting halaga, makakasiguro ka na makakasabay siya sa mabilis na pag-ikot ng mundo. Sa New Era, karamay mo kami sa bawat hamon. Kaagapay mo kami sa bawat hakbang. Kasama mo kami sa bawat ngiti at tagumpay.
Welcome back, and we're still following the developments on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg greets U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin as the alliance's defense ministers are meeting today to discuss the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Let's listen in.
At the meeting today, we will also not only address the immediate consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but we will also address the more long-term consequences, the long-term adaptation of our alliance, how to further strengthen our deterrence and defense, and to remove any room for miscalculation or misunderstanding in Moscow about our readiness to protect and defend all allies. NATO has the responsibility to ensure that this crisis do not escalate beyond Ukraine, and that's also the reason why we have increased the presence in the eastern part of the alliance.
I think our presence here sends a signal to the world that we remain united in our support of Ukraine, and we condemn Russia's unprovoked and unjustified invasion into Ukraine.
Meanwhile, U.S. network Fox News released these photos of cameraman Pierre Zarkevsky, who was killed in Ukraine. He was killed and his colleague Benjamin Hall was wounded when their vehicle was struck by incoming fire in Horenka, outside of Kiev on Monday. That according to Fox News Media CEO Suzanne Scott in a statement. Scott also said Pierre was a war zone photographer who covered nearly every international story for Fox News, from Iraq to Afghanistan to Syria, during his long tenure with us. His passion, they said, and talent as a journalist were unmatched. 2 other Ukrainian journalists, as well as a U.S. documentary filmmaker, have also been killed. In a packed session of Canada's Parliament, President Zelensky again pleaded for a NATO nation to create a no-fly zone.
Справедливість. Нам потрібно шукати дієві гарантії. Гарантії для нас, для нашого неба. І ми від цього не відмовимось. Нам потрібні літаки. Я продовжу про це говорити. Продовжу цього добиватись. Нам потрібні довгострокові безпекові гарантії для держави, для всіх українців. Але конкретні речі, конкретні гарантії, юридично закріплені, щоб жодного сумніву у них не було. І щоб не звучало.
And I would say that yes, we recognize there are a range of bipartisan calls, but what we have the responsibility to do here is to assess what the impact is on the United States and our own national security. A no-fly zone is escalatory and could prompt a war with Russia, a major nuclear power. Providing the planes, our military did an assessment that's based not just on the risk, but whether it would have a huge benefit to them. They assessed it would not.
NATO allies, including Canada, have rejected that proposal, fearing it would lead to an expansion of the conflict. On Wednesday, President Zelensky is to address the American Congress after already having spoken to the British and European parliaments. Earlier, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced sanctions against 15 more Russian officials, including government and military elites, who are complicit in this war. Take a look.
Today, in line with our European Union partners, I can announce that we have imposed severe sanctions on 15 new Russian officials, including government and military elites who are complicit in this illegal war. Ukrainians are already paying incalculable human costs. This illegal and unnecessary war is a grave mistake, and Putin must stop it now.
Marina Ovsyannikova, the journalist who protested against the conflict during a primetime news broadcast on Russian state television, is fined and released. Take a look.
Я хочу поблагодарить всех за поддержку, друзья, коллеги. Это была действительно очень сложные дни в моей жизни, потому что я провела буквально 2 суток без сна, больше 14 часов длился допрос, и мне не давали не связаться с моими родными и близкими, мне не предоставляли никакой юридической помощи.
A Moscow court ordered her to pay a fine of 30,000 rubles or $280 or 247 euros after she barged onto the set of Russia's most watched evening news broadcast holding a poster reading "No War." In other development, almost one child per second in Ukraine is becoming a refugee of the war, according to UN humanitarians, as the total number of people who have now fled the country since the Russian invasion began passed 3 million, highlighting that 9 in 10 of those fleeing unrelenting violence in Ukraine are women and children. The UN Children's Fund warned that youngsters are prey to traffickers as they arrive in unfamiliar new surroundings. Take a look.
We have now reached the 3 million mark in terms of movements of people out of Ukraine to neighboring countries. And amongst these people, there are some 157,000 third country nationals.
Every day, over the past 20 days, in Ukraine, more than 70,000 children have become refugees. Okay, that's every minute 55 children fleeing the country. To give a sense, at the border that I used to visit, the main border, Medyak, Poland to Ukraine, it is scores of people standing around buses and minivans calling out names of capital cities, or at least it was a week ago, and people getting onto those. The vast, vast majority, of course, are people with wonderful intentions and great generosity, but there is no doubt, given what we understand of trafficking in Europe, and that remains a very, very grave issue.
At Ukraine's border with neighboring countries, overwhelming numbers of traumatized people have arrived, creating opportunities for criminal gangs who are known to flourish in conflicts. Amid reports that families are also being forced to gather water from streams and that fights have also broken out over food, the UN urged the Ukrainian and Russian authorities to find a solution so that aid can reach the city's people. More stories in connection to the Russian invasion to Ukraine. 2 main players in the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee were ambushed, interviewed by our Eagle correspondent El Aguilar in New Jersey. Let's take a listen.
New Jersey State Senator Robert Menendez, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, stressed how important it is for the United States to go after the Russian oligarchs in an ambush interview at the Ukrainian-American event in New Jersey.
We're targeting Russian oligarchs everywhere, getting their yachts, freezing their accounts, finding every single way to cripple them economically so that the pain goes to the very top of the Russian elite, but also the type of pain that the Russian people will feel as a result of it.
This is in connection to the White House statement that the U.S. and allied countries, including the European Union, Switzerland, Canada, Japan, Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand, to impose sanctions from banking and investments to freezing of assets against Russian leaders, the oligarchs, and their families.
So we have put a task force together that is comprised of Treasury, the FBI, and other federal departments that are just focused on oligarchs.
The new task force, involving interagency law enforcement officers from FBI, Marshal Service, IRS, Postal Inspection, Homeland Security Investigations, and Secret Service, will track down and pursue Russian officials, government-aligned elites, and those who aid or conceal illegal activities. The task force is using different tools, including cryptocurrency tracing, to follow those who are in violation of sanctions and hiding ill-begotten assets and wealth. 2 of Russia's largest banks and its subsidiaries have been cut off from processing payments through the U.S. financial system. Senator Cory Booker also attended the Ukrainian-American event. Booker is also a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
What you see here is a united group of Ukrainian Americans who are standing for the freedom of Ukraine. And it's something that I share their commitment to, and will continue to do everything I can that we keep Ukraine free and beat back the despotism, the unprovoked, violent attack of Vladimir Putin.
Any word about taking refugees here?
We've opened the doors. We're going to work with the United States State Department. We should. We've done it for the Afghan people, and we've got to do it now. So anything that we can do, we were the #1 state for welcoming Afghani refugees, and we will open New Jersey up with the same offer to the State Department.
Appeal to everyone. Thank you.
My appeal to everyone is to support a free Ukraine and understand that it is intrinsically tied to the safety and the security of the United States of America.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Also here in New Jersey, an executive order approved by Governor Phil Murphy requiring all state agencies to suspend or revoke any business relations and financial institutions supporting the Russian government in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. New Jersey is one of the first states in America to establish such an executive order. The Russian invasion has killed nearly 100 children, and according to the United Nations, over 3 million Ukrainians have fled to different neighboring countries. From New Jersey Bureau, Ellen Aguilar for Eagle News. We live in interesting times.
Meanwhile, the United Kingdom sanctioned Russian lawmakers who supported Ukraine breakaways of Lugansk and Donetsk. And these Duma members will be banned from traveling or doing business in the UK and even accessing assets held there. Here's Nicole Salenga for the details.
Britain on Friday slapped a fresh wave of sanctions in Moscow, targeting 386 members of Russia's parliament who supported President Vladimir Putin's devastating invasion of Ukraine. The new sanctions against members of Russia's Duma, the lower house of parliament, banned them from traveling to Britain, as well as accessing any assets they hold in the UK. The lawmakers were sanctioned after they voted in February to recognize the breakaway republics of Lugansk and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine, providing a pretext for the war, British Foreign Ministry said.
We are absolutely determined to sanction Russian oligarchs. We've already sanctioned over 100 individuals and organisations. We've got a further list we are working through. We have put in place the toughest package of sanctions in British history.
The move came after the government on Thursday froze the assets of Chelsea Football Club's Russian owner, Roman Abramovich, the highest profile oligarch yet sanctioned by any Western country. Abramovich, 55, was one of 7 more oligarchs slapped with new British restrictions over the invasion, including his former business partner, Oleg Deripaska. Prime Minister Boris Johnson had been accused of delaying action against wealthy Russians and turning a blind eye to Russian money that has coursed through London since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russian vessels and aircrafts are already barred from the UK. Reporting from London, United Kingdom, I am Nicole Salenga. We live in interesting times.
Thanks, Nicole. We'll be back right after this break.
Karapatan natin lahat na iboto ang karapat-dapat! Tama! Lahat ng Pilipino pwedeng bumoto!
Kung rehistrado ka.
Ha?
Ang lahat ng Pilipinong rehistrado lamang ang maaaring bumoto. 1 taon ang ibinibigay ng Commission on Elections para magparehistro ang mga Pilipinong boboto sa darating na eleksyon. Kailangan gawin ito para maiwasan ang tinatawag na flying voters. Teka, lahat ba kayo nagparehistro na?
Opo! Rehistrado na kami lahat!
Bakit tahimik ka? Hindi ka nakapagrehistro, no?
Nakakalimutan ko.
Ay, hindi ka pwedeng bumoto. Mabuti pa, bumili ka na lang ng balot.
Pagka gabi pa bumili ng balot, pwede na kami bumoto.
Hindi, pero mabubusog ka. Para sa karagdagang kaalaman, makipag-ugnayan lang sa pinakamalapit na barangay o bisitahin ang COMELEC website.
A public service message of Net25 for Mata ng Halalan 2022. Matatag, matapang, matapat.
Mula noon hanggang ngayon, gabay natin ang MTRCB ratings sa matalino at responsableng panonood. Sa tamang pagsunod sa MTRCB ratings, ginagawa nating ligtas at makabuluhan ang panonood ng bawat miyembro ng pamilyang Pilipino. Lumipas man ang panahon, hanggang may pamilyang Pilipino, andyan ang MTRCB.
Ang morning show na always nagbibigay ng ngiti at saya sa bawat kada all over the world. Tara na't ma-inspire at ma-amaze sa kwento ng mga bawat kada na nagwagi sa anumang hamon at pagsubok ng buhay. Itago ng mga remote control at tumambay lang dito sa paborito niyong barkada sa umaga, ang Kada Umaga! Dahil kayo ang bida dito.
Welcome back. Nazanin Ratcliffe, who has been held in Iran since 2016, was today handed over to the UK authorities in Tehran. For the details, joining us live is Arian Celestino. Hello, Arian.
Hi, Alma. And yes, Nazanin Ratcliffe, who has been held in Iran since 2016, is at the airport in Tehran and on her way home. Her local MT in London, Philip Siddiq, tweeted on Wednesday. Hopes were raised about the dual nationality UK Iranian's release after she had her British passport returned to her on Tuesday, amid reports that a UK negotiating team was in Iran. Siddiq's comment follows reports that London and Tehran may be close to resolving a long-standing dispute over a debt dating back to the time of the Shah of Iran. Ratcliffe's husband, Richard Ratcliffe, believes his wife is being held as a political pawn until the debt of £400 million for defense equipment is resolved. Resolving the dispute could clear the way for the release of other UK nationals held in Iran. Ratcliffe was arrested during a visit to her family in the Iranian capital in 2016 and convicted of plotting to overthrow the government. She was jailed for 5 years. She was sentenced to a further year's imprisonment in April last year for participating in a rally outside the Iranian embassy in London in 2009. Richard Ratcliffe staged a hunger strike outside the Foreign Ministry in London last October after she lost her latest appeal, and as government ministers held talks with the Iranian counterparts. She was freed from prison with an electronic tag in March 2020 because of the coronavirus pandemic. But she has been held in Iran under a form of house arrest ever since. That's all from me. Back to you, Alma.
Thank you very much, Arian, for that update. Stay safe.
Reporting from the United Kingdom, I am Arian Celestino. We live in interesting times.
Meanwhile, all areas in the country must be placed under alert level 1 before the government could impose a lower status of COVID risk classification. That, according to a health official during a palace briefing, Health Undersecretary Maria Rosario Vergeire said the government is looking forward to having all provinces, highly urbanized cities, and independent component cities under the alert level 1. Take a look.
Unang-una, yung alert level 0 po is not a formal term and not an official term yet for the IATF and the government. Pag pinag-usapan po natin yung susunod na level pagkatapos ng alert level 1, iyan po ay pag-uusapan na hindi per area but for the country already. Ibig sabihin, ang kasunod na po ng alert level 1 ay makita natin mag-alert level 1 na ang lahat ng areas sa ating bansa. Ang rason po kung bakit hindi po tayo bumababa pa beyond alert level 1 is because may kaso pa rin naman po tayo. Hindi pa rin naman po tayo nawawala ng kaso at sa katunayan dito po sa NCR, we are still averaging about 162 cases per day dito po sa National Capital Region. So hindi pa rin po natin tinatanggal ang alert level 1.
Now, Yusek Vergere also noted that discussions on further easing of restrictions and refocusing of resources would start when all areas nationwide are under alert level 1. She said the government would review whether dedicated hospital beds for COVID cases, quarantine facilities in local government units, and testing surveillance are still needed. The National Capital Region and 47 other areas have been placed under the alert level 1 from March 16 to the end of the month. And the Department of Health also said they will apply for an amended emergency use authorization for the administration of a fourth dose of COVID-19 vaccine after discussions with all expert groups are finished. Let's listen in.
No? So alam naman po natin nakapaglabas po ang vaccine expert panel ng mga rekomendasyon ukol sa fourth doses o yung tinatawag na second booster para sa piling populasyon dito sa ating bansa katulad po ng immunocompromised individuals at saka mga senior citizens. Ito po ngayon ay pinag-aaralan ng ating all experts group. Pero ang pinaka-importante po kasi ay ma-amend muna ang emergency use authority for these fourth doses. So DOH, pagkatapos po makapag-usap the all experts group, mag-a-apply po ang DOH for an amended EUA so that we can be able to do these fourth doses.
Earlier, VAP member Dr. Ron Jean Solante said a fourth dose or second booster may not be needed for the younger population or immunocompetent. He said the third dose or first booster may be enough for them as protection against the severe type of COVID-19. Meanwhile, South Korea reported more than 400,000 new COVID cases today, a new record, as the country continues to ease restrictions despite the Omicron-fueled wave of infections.
우선 생각보다 걷잡을 수 없이 확진자가 늘어나서 조금 불안한 감정이 조금씩 커지고 있는 것 같습니다. 백신이 완벽하게 지금 작용하지 않는 것 같기도 하고 결국은 대부분의 인원들이 다 감염이 되고 집단 면역이 그런 식으로 생겨야지 끝나지 않을까 싶기도 합니다.
Health authorities said 400,741 cases were recorded, the country's highest daily figure since the pandemic began 2 years ago. The latest spike in cases is the last biggest challenge facing the country, according to Son Young-rae, a senior health official, during a press briefing. The vast majority of South Korea's eligible population has been vaccinated and boosted. And despite the record number of infections in the country of 52 million people, death rates remain very low. The country has also continued to relax its social distancing rules under pressure from small businesses and self-employed Koreans who say years-long COVID restrictions had pushed their businesses to the brink. The country now has an 11 p.m. curfew for businesses and a 6-person limit for private gatherings. It will lift mandatory quarantine on arrival for fully vaccinated visitors from March 21st. The government is expected to decide whether to further relax or keep the current distancing guidelines this Friday. Seoul abandoned its vaunted trace, test, and treat program last month as a dramatic surge in Omicron cases threatened to overwhelm its healthcare system. Meanwhile, Vietnam announced an end to quarantine for international travelers today as it seeks to restart its tourism industry after 2 years of strict COVID restrictions. The only virus requirement for visitors will be a negative COVID test, according to the country's Ministry of Health in a statement. The communist state's tourism sector was worth up to $32 billion a year before the pandemic, but it ground to a standstill during the pandemic as the government restricted travel. Virus curbs have slowly been eased in recent months, with visitors trickling back in since November to play golf at resorts under a bubble arrangement. Vietnam also announced the resumption of 15 days visa-free travel for citizens from 13 countries, namely Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Britain, Russia, Japan, South Korea, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Belarus. The country, which has a population of 97 million, is still reporting nearly 200,000 new COVID cases a day as the Omicron variant sweeps through. But the health ministry says the situation remains under control, with hospitalization and death rates staying low. Officials attribute to the high vaccination rate, with 98% of adults fully inoculated, according to the health ministry. In other news, the director of Western Mexico news outlet Monitor, Michoacan, was murdered Tuesday. According to local prosecutor's office, his death marks the 8th killing of a media worker in the country so far this year. In a statement, the Michoacan prosecutor's office said Armando Linares was murdered this afternoon in a private home. Linares' murder came just 6 weeks after one of his colleagues at the Monitor, Michoacan Roberto Toledo, was also murdered. After Toledo's death on January 31st, Linares denounced threats against him and his team for having exposed corruption. Linares is the 8th journalist murdered so far this year in Mexico, one of the most dangerous countries for media workers, according to Reporters Without Borders and Article 19. To Myanmar now, where security forces have killed at least 1,600 people and detained more than 12,500 since the military coup last year, according to the UN Rights Office. In a new report warning that serious rights abuses uncovered in Myanmar may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity, according to UN Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, and she appealed to the international community to take concerted immediate measures to stem the spiral of violence. Here's UN Rights Office spokesperson Ravina Shamdasani.
We have just released a new report that sets out the continuing spiral of violence in Myanmar since the 1st of February coup of last year. And the military is continuing to engage in systematic and widespread human rights violations and abuses, some of which may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. The report sets out Myanmar's military and security forces' flagrant disregard for human life, bombarding populated areas with airstrikes and heavy weapons, and deliberately targeting civilians, some of whom have been shot in the head, burned to death, arbitrarily arrested, tortured, or used as human shields. And throughout the tumult and the violence of the past year, the will of the people clearly has not been broken. They remain committed to seeing a return to democracy and to institutions that reflect their will and their aspirations. The report concludes that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the military, the Tatmadaw, has engaged in violence and abuse as part of a widespread and systematic attack against civilians. Patterns of conduct that may amount to crimes against humanity. Mass killings have taken place. In July, in Sagang region, soldiers killed 40 individuals in a series of raids. Villagers found the remains of some victims with their hands and feet still tied behind their backs. In December, in Kaya State, soldiers burned the bodies of up to 40 men, women, and children. Villagers described discovering the remains in several trucks, with the bodies found in positions indicating that they had tried to escape and they were burned. Meaningful action by the international community is urgently needed to stop yet more individuals from being stripped of their rights, their lives, and their livelihoods.
At least 440,000 others have been displaced since the military takeover on February 1st, 2021, according to the UN report. A further 14 million are in need of urgent humanitarian assistance, but aid deliveries have largely been blocked by the military in new and pre-existing areas of need, it noted. In other news, a large cruise ship carrying 3,000 tourists that ran aground off the coast of the Dominican Republic was refloated on Tuesday following 8 hours of work to free it, according to authorities. The Norwegian Escape, which ran aground Monday after leaving Puerto Plata, was rescued without major incidents, and all the tourists and crew on board were unharmed. That, according to the Dominican Navy, saying this on social media. The cruise ship, which was a 1,600 crew members on board, returned to Puerto Plata for inspections before being allowed to set sail. The Navy said it had created an investigatory commission to look into the factors that resulted in the cruise ship running aground. Vice Admiral Ramon Gustavo Bestances Hernandez said that the ship had run aground due to strong 30-knot winds, but he added that the tide would rise by around 1 meter at 4 a.m., thus facilitating rescue efforts. In other news, North Korea fired a suspected ballistic missile that exploded mid-air shortly after launch, according to Seoul, with analysts warning it was likely a failed test of Pyongyang's so-called monster missile. The launch, North Korea's 10th suspected weapons test this year, comes after the United States said the nuclear-armed country was preparing to fire an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, at full range for the first time since 2017. Despite biting international sanctions over its weapons programs, Pyongyang conducted 7 missile tests in January and twice launched components of what it claimed was a reconnaissance satellite. South Korea and the U.S. said last week those tests were actually of a new ICBM system that has never been launched before, likely the Hwasong-17, dubbed a monster missile by analysts after it was first unveiled at a parade in October 2020. The launch was from the Sunan area in Pyongyang around 09:30 a.m. local time. They said the same site as the February 27 and March 5 satellite tests. And we'll be back with more news right after this break. Stay tuned.
We're open for business, giving MSMEs the latest market trends and business opportunities. Open for business, only on Net 25.
Hinihiling ko na buksan ulit ang kaso niya. Bitiwan mo ako, sabi
Kita mo muna ang tiyan mo.
Matuto kang gumalang sa babae. Naintindihan mo ba ako?
Alam ko ang ambisyon mo matagal na. Pero akong pinakamatandang anak ng pamilya. Ako ang karapat-dapat na tagapagmana.
Ano? Siya pala si Nari. Siya ang apo ni President na ng Gusong Group. Magvi-video lang ako saglit kaya paantay na lang ako, ha?
Kilalanin at maki-hangout sa kanila. Never twice. Weeknights, pagkatapos ng panalo o talo, it's you. Dito lang sa Net 25, primetime ng pamilya. Let's get together sa init ng summer.
Asian equities rallied today after their recent rout with Hong Kong, leading the way after Chinese authorities pledged to provide support and stability to the country's troubled markets. Traders were piling back into regional stocks to snap up bargains in the wake of a sell-off fueled by concerns about the war in Ukraine, the U.S. Federal Reserve's plans to start hiking interest rates, and COVID outbreaks in China that threaten its growth outlook. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index was at the forefront with an eye-watering spike of more than 9% that came after a report by the official Xinhua news agency saying China will keep the stock market stable and support overseas share listings. Shanghai's Composite Index joined in the rally, putting on more than 3%. The rest of Asia also enjoyed a much-needed bright day. Tokyo, Sydney, Seoul, Singapore, Bangkok, and Mumbai were all up more than 1%. Wellington, Taipei, Manila, and Jakarta were also well up. And in Europe, London put on more than 1% at the open, while Paris and Frankfurt were up 2.3% each. Crude enjoyed some fresh buying sentiment Wednesday, with Brent back into triple figures on expectations that sanctions on Russia will mean supplies remain tight even if the war is brought to an end soon. The spike in crude, as well as other commodities, including wheat and metals, has caused a headache for central banks as they try to move away from pandemic-era monetary policy and rein in inflation. And Kyrie Irving scored a career-high 60 points in a dazzling display as the Brooklyn Nets stretched their NBA winning streak with a 150-108 thrashing of the Orlando Magic on Tuesday. Take a look.
History, man. Making history. And, doing it that guy is very special. But again, credit goes to our group. It's just really how close we are. Our guys in our locker room, they really believe in us. They really rock with us. There's not a doubt in our mind that they really believe that we can do something special, and not just this year, but for years to come. We have a good group, and we're all sacrificing something that's bigger than ourselves. So when we come into the locker room, we just enjoy being with each other and playing the game that we love.
Yeah, I mean, he's just incredible. I felt like he had my career highlight reel the first 12 minutes of the game. So it's when it's special to watch him every night, but it's special to watch him on nights like this where he's in total control, total command. Gets wherever he wants and is able to finish amongst the trees. It's just a pleasure to see it up close and to be a part of it.
Net star Irving, who had bagged 50 points last week in a victory over Charlotte, delivered another performance for the ages against an outclassed Magic at Orlando's Amway Center. Irving's tour de force surpassed his previous career best of 57 points set in 2015 while playing for the Cleveland Cavaliers in a victory over the San Antonio Spurs. The 29-year-old Australian-born seven-time All-Star made 20 of 31 from the field, making 8 of 12 attempts from outside the arc. A career-high performance for Irving looked inevitable after an explosive first half from Brooklyn. The Nets piled on 48 points in the first quarter alone before adding 38 in the second quarter to lead 85-56 at halftime. Irving contributed 41 points in that devastating first half, leaving him only 16 shy of his individual record. He brought up 50 points, the sixth half-century of his career, with a driving layup in the third quarter, prompting appreciative chants of Kyrie from the Orlando crowd. And with that, we end today's broadcast. As always, I'll end the day on a thoughtful note. Our ability to look back and smile at our past is proof that God's plan is to keep us moving forward. This has been Eagle News International. I'm Alma Angela. Stay alert and stay informed because we live in interesting times. Good night.